Good evening and welcome to the symposium of the LaRouche Organization. I'm Diane Sayre, president of the LaRouche Organization. Today is April 4th. April 4th is the 57th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1968. And we will be talking about not only the assassination, the implications of the assassination, and also what I particularly want to underscore is the importance of Martin Luther King as a representative of a true patriotic tradition of the United States, which Lyndon LaRouche, I believe, had the greatest understanding of any American or anyone in the world that I have known. And I think this is why he placed such an important emphasis on the life and work of Martin Luther King, and in fact said that Dr. Martin Luther King was someone who could have been president. He was a presidential quality. Now, I'm joined by Dennis Speed, who is the moderator and host of the Manhattan Project in New York City. And he and I and our spouses have been privileged, frankly, to work with many people from the civil rights movement who worked with King directly, to travel in the South together, which was quite a shock for me in some ways, a young Yankee from Maine, realizing what had happened in our country, what that was like. And I'll just say this comes at an urgent moment because we are in a period of very rapid change. And to that end, as I always do, I will say this show is being recorded on the 4th, but a few hours prior to 7 p.m. Things are happening so fast, there could be a major development between now and the time the show is aired. So please understand that if such a thing occurs. We have the presidency of Donald Trump. He's been in office now 2.5 months, sort of, barely, and things have really been turned upside down, or right side up, or turned from upside down toward a direction which might be right side up, and it's for us to determine that. The right people are certainly very freaked out about this, namely the British Empire, who are doing everything they can to prevent the most important initiative that Trump has taken, which is to restore normal diplomacy with the major nuclear superpower of the Russian Federation. That is first and foremost of urgent priority, because if the United States and Russia develop diplomatic relations where they can work productively together in areas of shared concern, then the situation, for example, in the Middle East could be resolved. The Ukraine-Russia war can be brought to an end. I think Presidents Trump and Putin really want to do this. And for that reason, the British and the French are instructing their lackeys in Ukraine to launch strikes on energy infrastructure. Exactly what was agreed would not be done. They are holding frantic meetings in Europe to come up with 800 billion euros for quote unquote defense. And of course, this is absurd because since Biden blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, they don't even have the energy. They don't have the industry. This is just a big money laundering scheme, which has the added benefit, if you think like the British, of killing a lot of people because their financial system is on the ropes. And in that context, something that we had hoped would be an ongoing ceasefire in between Israel and Palestine, with the prospect of an economic reconstruction plan for the whole region along the lines of Lyndon LaRouche's Oasis plan, was very short-lived. Bibi Netanyahu blockaded Gaza starting on March 2nd. The Houthi had stopped bombing Israeli-bound ships and Israeli ships, but they began doing it again. They stopped for the ceasefire. They began bombing. They began attacking, launching strikes on these vessels, and therefore so-called. Therefore, I use that advisedly because I don't think we should be bombing Yemen at all. President Trump started dumping a whole bunch of bombs on Yemen as a threat toward Iran. This is really problematic. And it is not going to work in that way. But this is Trump's peculiar way of diplomacy. And now apparently he has expressed that he would be willing to engage in indirect talks with Iran. Now, this whole approach to diplomacy brings me to what I would like to say by way of introduction, which is the subjective and moral side of Martin Luther King, which is science. Morality and science and human progress are intertwined. When Henry Kissinger said, "I never mix morality with politics," that should tell you something. This is a sermon from Martin Luther King's book of sermons called Strength to Love. And if we can go to the first slide, Dave, I just want to show the book. So in the very first sermon, Martin Luther King calls it a tough mind and a tender heart. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. I am afraid that the current American approach to diplomacy is a soft mind and a hard heart. And that is not the way to deal with especially world-class leaders like President Putin and Xi Jinping, who are deep philosophical minds, leaders of powerful nations, have vast experience, speak multiple languages in the case of Putin, and have a great grasp of history. So let's just jump right into this. We can go to the first slide. Now, just before we get to this, King says, a French philosopher said, "No man is strong unless he bears within his character and antitheses strongly marked." And then later, Jesus recognized the need for blending opposites. He knew that his disciples would face a difficult and hostile world where they would confront the recalcitrance of political officials and the intransigence of the protectors of the old order. He knew that they would meet cold and arrogant men whose hearts had been hardened by the long winter of traditionalism. So he said to them, "Behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves." And he gave them a formula for action. Be ye therefore wise as serpents and harmless as doves. It is pretty difficult to imagine a single person having simultaneously the characteristics of the serpent and the dove, but this is what Jesus expects. We must combine the toughness of the serpent and the softness of the dove, a tough mind and a tender heart. We can go on. Just before I get to this next section, King says, let us consider first the need for a tough mind, characterized by incisive thinking, realistic appraisal, and decisive judgment. The tough mind is sharp and penetrating, breaking through the crust of legends and myths, sifting the true from the false, while, here we go, soft-minded individuals are prone to embrace all kinds of superstitions. Their minds are constantly invaded by irrational fears, which range from fear of Friday the 13th to fear of a black cat crossing one's path. The soft-minded man always fears change. He feels security in the status quo, and he has an almost morbid fear of the new. For him, the greatest pain is the pain of a new idea. This has also led to a widespread belief that there is a conflict between science and religion, but this is not true. There may be a conflict between soft-minded religionists and tough-minded scientists, but not between science and religion. I just have to interject here that this is so much like Lyndon LaRouche's thinking and admonition on the question of science and art, the fake division between science and art, and also LaRouche's description of the scientist as being one who loves to be proven wrong, a challenge for everyone. King goes on, we do not need to look far to detect the dangers of soft-mindedness. Dictators capitalizing on soft-mindedness have led men to acts of barbarity and terror that are unthinkable in civilized society. Adolf Hitler realized that soft-mindedness was so prevalent among his followers that he said, quote, I use emotion for the many and reserve reason for the few, unquote. Now here, before I get to the last parts, just the new curriculum, this thing called Common Core Curriculum, where they changed the reading standards, and they said, first, one of the things they said is we should have no more fiction. Students should read educational, or not instructional text. Like the most important thing for a 5-year-old is to know how to assemble the parts of their cell phone or video game when it arrives from Amazon. This is so disgusting. They also said that if you want people to learn, children to learn how to read, forget phonics, forget actually teaching literacy. What you want is text that is really emotional. Make it about sex, make it about violence, and people will get addicted and dragged in emotionally. They'll get emotionally obsessed, and that's how you learn. So you had a curriculum designed to create soft-minded people by the same technique that Hitler said. I just want to really point that out when you think of how insightful this was that Martin Luther King was going through. Okay, next. But we must not stop with the cultivation of a tough mind. The gospel also demands a tender heart. Tough-mindedness without tender-heartedness is cold and detached, leaving one's life in a perpetual winter, devoid of the warmth of spring and the gentle heat of the summer. What is more tragic than to see a person who has risen to the disciplined heights of tough-mindedness, but has at the same time sunk to the passionless depths of hard-heartedness? We can go on. And so towards the end of the sermon, King said, there are times when we need to know that God is a God of justice. When evil forces rise to the throne and slumbering giants of injustice rise up in the earth, we need to know that there is a God of justice who can cut them down like a green hay there and leave them withering like the grass. But there are times when we need to know that God is a God of love and mercy. When we are staggered by the chill winds of adversity and the battering storms of disappointment, when through our folly and sin we stray into some destructive far country and are frustrated because of a strange homesickness, we need to know that there is someone who loves us, who understands, and who can and who will give us another chance. When days grow dark and nights grow dreary, we can be thankful that our God is not a one-sided, incomplete God, but that he combines in this nature a creative synthesis of love and justice, which can lead us through life's dark valley to sunlit pathways of hope and fulfillment. So, as I said, if you consider the approach that we seem to be taking in diplomacy these days, it is soft-mindedness and hard-heartedness. We will bludgeon you if you don't do X, as opposed to getting a strategic understanding of all of the factors at play and offering something which can uplift everyone involved. And I think this is why it's so very urgent that we study the work and writing of Dr. King. So I'm going to stop there and let Dennis go ahead.
Well, Diane, there's a lot of things to discuss today. There's a lot going on today. Maybe the thing to do, I think, is try to give people an idea um, why the King matters in a way which is different than you might assume. We have I think, a video, short video. It's actually an excerpt from a show. It's an older show in which the interviewer, this is from DJ Vlad, I guess is the guy's name, is talking to Judge Joe Brown. Judge Joe Brown was well known to television audiences about a decade and a half ago, but the judge is a rather colorful character and happened to be one of the last uh, people involved in hearing the Martin Luther King case. If we have that, I'd like to just have that shown because the issue of the assassination, which is what today is the 57th anniversary of, should be at least recalled in the image of the hearings that happened this week, actually in the Congress, uh, pertaining to the JFK files. So I'd like us just to take a look at this. It's a couple of minutes, and I have a commentary to make about what you're going to see.
When you were around 19 years old, Martin Luther King got assassinated.
No, I was older than that. I was a senior in college.
Okay, so you're about 22 or so?
I was 21.
21. Okay, so you clearly remember as an adult the impact of that situation.
Well, for me, that was a small impact. I wound up being the last judge hearing the James Earl Ray matter. Did he, in fact, assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King? And had he not died and his local attorney not died in close succession, it would have been my finding that he was not the gunman. That Remington 760 Game Master they've got in the Civil Rights Museum is not the murder weapon. It's not even close. And it was a two-man hit team that killed him from the fire station dormitory. It wasn't the flop house, and it wasn't in those bushes. So, yeah, I got into the deep details of Dr. King, and that 3 or 4 year period that case was kicking around in front of me. The thing the state relied upon was the rifle, but modern scientific methodology excluded that rifle from being the murder weapon. The bullet they pull out of King's body has a rate of rifling twist of 1 turn in every 11 1/4 inches. The rifle that Ray had a rate of rifling twist of 1 turn in every 10 inches and a bad manufacturing defect that is not apparent on the death slug. He was shot with an XM-21. It's a 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO caliber weapon with a special stainless steel barrel, a 3-9 telescopic sight modified by a company known as Leatherwood. It was a Redfield sight, and they used special subsonic ammunition with a suppressor on the end to reduce the velocity of the bullet to below supersonic to confuse the sound signature. The shot came from the dormitory in the fire station through a window that had been slightly parted. They were several feet inside. It was a two-man team, a spotter and a shooter. That's what he got killed by.
Thing just to understand concerning the matter around the assassination. There are many other things. I'll just indicate something people would not necessarily have seen. This is a book which is called Who Killed Martin Luther King by James Earl Ray. Ray was visited in prison by the person, Reverend James Bevel, who ran for vice president together with Lyndon LaRouche in 1992. James Earl Ray was visited much earlier in the period of the late 60s, early 70s by Reverend James Bevel. And in 1994, while he was still alive, Reverend Bevel and I traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, and met with Dexter King, son of Martin Luther King, to urge that he might visit James Earl Ray as well. He did do that. That was after discussion, of course, with his mother, Coretta, and and that he questioned Ray himself. Dexter concluded that Ray was not the assassin as well. This is not. Some of this has been in newspapers. Um, there's also differences in the King family. There are other matters that should better not to discuss about the entire circumstance. But it's important to have some idea what Lyndon LaRouche's relationship was to this matter. There's a video, The Immortal Talent of Dr. Martin Luther King, which Lyndon LaRouche delivered. And perhaps at some other time, it'd be useful to reference that. I'm not going to
Dennis, that will be played on Sunday morning at 10 a.m.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Very good. So people can see it there. But let's come back to now and something that might shock you. The main thing I think I want to give people the impression is that uh, King is not understood in the United States. I don't mean his nonviolence. I don't mean he's not appreciated merely. He's just not understood. In the same way that Frederick Douglass was the most qualified person to be president besides Abraham Lincoln in 1861, but that wasn't going to happen. King, in the period of the 1960s, was the most qualified person at that time, including Robert Kennedy and others, to be president, and that was not going to happen. Some people tried to make that occur as an independent candidacy. There was a discussion about King running together with Benjamin Spock, a famous figure at the time. King refused to do that, and I think that was correct. But just to give an indication of King's actual role in America, we have a quote from him, and this pertains to the 6-Day War, the Arab-Israeli War of June 10th to 15th, no, June 5th to 10th, excuse me, of 1967. King appeared on a show called Issues and Answers, and he was asked a question about what had just happened in the war. And this is what he had to say. If we can bring that up, I'll just go through it. Let's go to the first questions asked him. Let's go to the other war for a moment, Dr. King. What are your views as a Nobel Peace Prize winner on the complex situation in the Middle East? And then King responds, well, it is certainly a very complex situation. I think first that we must work passionately and unrelentingly through the United Nations to try to grapple with this years-old problem in the Middle East. I would hope that the Middle East will not become an arena for power politics, whether we refer to Soviet Russia here or the United States of America. We have got to achieve peace in the Middle East, and in the Middle East, achieving peace means two things. Peace for Israel means security. The world and all people of goodwill must respect the territorial integrity of Israel. We must see Israel's right to exist and always go out of the way to protect that right to exist. We must also see that Israel is there. And any talk of driving the Jews into the Mediterranean, as we have heard over the last few weeks or the last several years, is not only unrealistic talk, but it is suicidal talk for the whole world. And I think also it is terribly immoral. We must see what Israel has done for the world. It is a marvelous demonstration of what people together in unity and with determination, rugged determination, can do in transforming almost a desert into an oasis. But the other side is this, that peace in the Middle East means something else. It means for the Arabs development. After all, the Arab world is that third world, a part of that third world of poverty and illiteracy and disease, and it is time now to have a Marshall Plan for the Middle East. I think this is going to be, finally, the only answer. So long as people are poor, so long as they find themselves on the outskirts of hope, they are going to make intemperate remarks, They're going to keep the war psychosis alive. And what we need to do now is to go all out to develop the underdeveloped. And we must see that there is a grave refugee problem that the Arabs have on their hands. And the United Nations, through all of the nations of the world, must grapple very constructively and forthrightly with these problems. This statement is 58 years old. It is before there is an Israel nuclear program. I want to point out the nuclear weapon for Israel was probably achieved in 1966 and 67. It would have been completely secret, and indicates how King thought. This is 2 months after King's speech at Riverside Church called "Time to Break the Silence," which is when he first expressed his opposition to the war in Vietnam. And that opposition would cost him half of his fundraising base, or the collapse of his fundraising by 50%. He was said by 75% of the people of the United States at the time that he died to have basically become either irrelevant or be a negative factor. That's what they found. And so this was part of the price he paid for demanding that as he said, he not make a butchery of his conscience, and he also speak freely as he does here. And you can see the presidential quality, by which I mean someone who's able to deliberate on international problems and come by or arrive at solutions that implement what Diane was talking about and what she had to say. So I think that's sort of, first of all, kind of a way of placing what happened. I think the last thing I want to address right now is this issue of his assassination, because it's often said, well, it's because King did these things that he was killed. Well, that's not exactly true. It's true that his enemies certainly thought of it that way, but he didn't think about it that way. The important point here, and I understand that's something to kind of get a sense of. It's important to understand the United States of that time, because King was confronted at that time by a United States in which this was the mood coming from the Congress of the United States. This was a memo from the House Un-American Activities Committee. It was issued on May 5th of 1968. So this was issued a month after King's assassination. But it's relevant because, of course, it wasn't all thought about one month, just 1 month after. It's called Guerrilla Warfare in the United States, and this memo states a few things which I'll read to you. It's all from the Congress, and it is not. It is what they said. Guerrilla warfare, as envisioned by its proponents, they're talking about the Black Power movement, the movement that was associated with Stokely Carmichael, later called Kwame Ture, and other persons that were well known at the time. Guerrilla warfare, as envisioned by its proponents at this stage, would have to have its base in the ghetto. This being the case, the ghetto would have to be sealed off from the rest of the city. Police, state troopers, and the National Guard could adequately handle this chore, and if they needed help, the regular army would be brought into service. Once the ghetto is sealed off, and depending upon the violence being perpetrated by the guerrillas, the following actions could be taken by the authorities. 1. A curfew would be imposed in the enclosed isolated area. No one would be allowed out of or into the area after sundown. 2. During the night, the authorities would not only patrol the boundary lines, but would also attempt to control the streets and, if necessary, send out foot patrols throughout the entire area. If the guerrillas attempted to either break out of the area or to engage the authorities in open combat, they would be readily suppressed. 3. During a guerrilla uprising, most civil liberties would have to be suspended. Search and seizure operations would be instituted during the daylight hours, and anyone found armed or without proper identification would immediately be arrested. Most of the people of the ghetto would not be involved in the guerrilla operations, and under conditions of police and military control, some would help in ferreting out the guerrillas. Their help would be invaluable. 4. If the guerrillas were able to hold out for a period of time, then the population of the ghetto would be classified through an office for the control and organization of the inhabitants. This office would distribute census cards, which would bear a photograph of the individual, the letter of the district in which he lives, his house and street number, and a letter designating his home city. This classification would aid the authorities in knowing the exact location of any suspect and who is in control of any given district. Under such a system, movement would be proscribed and the ability of the guerrilla to move freely from place to place seriously curtailed. Goes on. Number 6, acts of overt violence by the guerrillas would mean that they had declared a state of war within the country and therefore would forfeit their rights as in wartime. The McCarran Act provides for various detention centers to be operated throughout the country, and these might well be utilized for the temporary imprisonment of warring guerrillas. So you have to understand that means anybody black in any ghetto in the United States who happens to be either in the vicinity of or perhaps a member of the Black Panther Party, for example, or any other organization. I otherwise would like to quote somebody else who worked with our organization until his death, Cornelius Gallagher. He's a congressman who gave a speech in 1970 in which he said this on the floor of the Congress. My friends, I must be candid with you and reveal to you my firm belief that we are in the process of losing our form of government and our way of life as it has developed since the founding of our republic. We are replacing democracy with something else, with something we have rejected throughout our history. Perhaps an illustration of what I mean may be found in the fact that a change from democracy to totalitarianism in those European states where such a change occurred was always preceded by stripping away of the same concepts as those guaranteed by our Fourth Amendment. The ruination of individual privacy has always heralded the destruction of human freedom. Indeed, the greatest privacy invader, dossier collector, and information keeper known to this century was Adolf Hitler. And Hitler carried forth his privacy invasion, his destruction of the human personality, without the benefit of computers, though I should tell you in all seriousness that one of the first orders for the new IBM punch cards was placed by the government of Nazi Germany. More about that has come out since that time. It's called IBM and the Holocaust. But the reason I read that is because that was the partial motivation together with the war in Vietnam, for the creation of what was called ARPA, which you know as the internet, which you now know as your cell phone and your iPad and this computer and the computers that we're speaking on. And that in essence, what was written in the Guerrilla Warfare in the United States memo is now daily fare and daily functioning all over the world. So when we talk about the ideas of King, and King's placement at that time and why it was important, here's why he was important. The population of that period, particularly those people who happened to be black, who were living in these various areas, in the aftermath of King's assassination, the violence, of course, erupted. King, the night of before April 4th, gave a speech. And in that speech, he had been threatened with assassination, and he talked about that in that speech at the end of the speech. But he began that speech in a very important way when I just want to reference this. He was speaking to a group of garbage men. 2,000 people approximately had gathered at what was called the Mason Church, named after the person that built the church. What happened was that it was a great rainstorm. There had been a rally there about 3 weeks earlier, and about 15,000 people. So this is very empty. And King had not wanted to give this speech. He was not actually scheduled to give the speech. His friend Ralph Abernathy insisted and implored him to come down. And he reluctantly did that, getting there, I think, sometime around about 9 o'clock. I think they started at 6 and he didn't show up until pretty late. And nobody quite had a sense of what he was going to say. And what happened was he walked in And the speech was extemporaneous. King often did that, although obviously in the case of the March on Washington, there's some other things he had prepared. And here's what he did. He came in and he said, something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. You know, if I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in? I would take my mental flight by Egypt, and I would watch God's children in their magnificent trek from the dark dungeons of Egypt through, or rather across the Red Sea, through the wilderness on toward the Promised Land. And in spite of its magnificence, I wouldn't stop there. I would move on by Greece and take my mind to Mount Olympus, and I would see Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Euripides, and Aristophanes assembled around the Parthenon. And I would watch them around the Parthenon as they discussed the great and eternal issues of reality. But I wouldn't stop there. And he continued in that way, going through the Roman Empire, going through the Italian Renaissance, going through the Reformation, and Martin Luther tacking his 95 Theses on the church in Wittenberg, and all that. And then he said, strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, if you allow me to live just a few years in the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy. Now, that's a strange statement to make because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. Then he goes through an extended speech, many different things are said. And the conclusion of that speech is the thing that people today know best as what they call the mountaintop speech. Because he just says, after describing how he almost died in Harlem in 1958 when he was stabbed in the chest. A lot of people don't know this story. But the blade went in about 2 inches from his 1 or 2 inches from his aorta. And it was said by the doctors that if he had sneezed, he would have died. And he tells a story about how a young girl, 10, 11 years old, had written to him and talked to him about how she was glad he didn't sneeze. And he talked about, what he would have missed if he had sneezed. And then he said, it doesn't really matter with me now. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I just want to do God's will. And he has allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. He was talking about the American people, not black people. King was always talking about the American people, even when he seemed to be talking about black people. And that was the only thing that stood at that time between the kind of paranoia that you heard there in that House Un-American Activities Committee statement and the actual America of that time. Now you might say, well, what happened and why did it happen? Well, it's happening now. And I'm not talking about, quote, the Trump administration. A lot of people like to do those things, sort of things. We don't play those kinds of cheap tricks. We know that there's an issue that confronts our country. And our country is confronted by this. Who has the guts? Who has the tough-mindedness? Who has the tender-heartedness to act as private citizens and have that kind of sway on the American mind, on the American psyche? Martin Luther King was not an elected official. He wasn't a billionaire. He didn't have a TV show. He wasn't an influencer. Well, he was an influencer, but how did he do that? You say, well, he was a clergyman and he came. Yes, but it was what? It was creative, nonviolent, direct action and the use of this by means of intervening on the American conscience. Now, that's something that TLO, to the LaRouche organization, and especially Diane and people like Jose Vega and others, have done through candidacies or not, because you don't really have to even be a candidate. But you do have to have this kind of conception of the self. And when I say King is underestimated, what I mean by that is not, oh, he's just not appreciated. I mean that uh, the reason for his being underestimated is because people want an excuse, that they need something. They have to be given permission to be human. You do not. You have had in the United States a demonstration of that in recent memory. And of course, he is on the mall, so to speak, with Lincoln and with Roosevelt and with Washington and others because he belongs there. Charlie Kirk may not think so, or others may not think so, but that's just because they don't recognize the significance of the United States. They have a problem understanding the nature of America. And I think on a day like this, especially when we look at these files and this issue of getting at the truth of the JFK assassination or the Martin Luther King assassination or the RFK assassination, we're not looking at simply trying to find the culprits that killed them. No, what we're trying to do is we are trying to uh, identify the culprits in ourselves that have prevented us from acting in the image of what those people did, which we all understand. So King was the freest man, one of the freest people in America, and certainly that night when he gave that speech, he said, I'm not worried about anything. I don't fear any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. So it was not a speech given out of fear. It was not merely a speech given out of defiance. It was a speech given out of love. And that strength to love is what King represented then and represents now.
Thanks very much. I think, when you read that material from the Congress, which you see over and over, it's the Israeli approach to the Palestinian population. It's the prison system's approach to the American people in our prison system. It's frankly been the so-called diplomatic, which is undiplomatic approach for quite some time, where they say, and I think we got to bring in another genius, which is Friedrich Schiller, whom Helga LaRouche brought to Lynn, who wrote his essay on the sublime, starting with "No man must. Man is the creature who wills." Lyndon LaRouche's autobiography is entitled "The Power of Reason," that human beings choose. And when you try to force human beings against their will and against their judgment or their mind, you will get a reaction. Ultimately, as Schiller says in the William Tell, there is a limit to a tyrant's power. Now, the British became a little more sophisticated and began understanding that. They decided in the 60s with the CIA and others to do this MK Ultra to subvert what people thought, or it was, I guess, Aldous Huxley who said it more explicitly, to make people love their bondage. And I think this is the challenge that we are dealing with also, because Americans have very much fallen into, or think about how we're talking about dealing with the migrants. Well, if we can really torture them and send them back to wherever and do everything in as brutal way as possible, then no one's going to come here. Well, that is not a solution. That is not going to stop people from needing to come here if we have a policy on the other end that's destroying their nation. And what about the equity of allowing people who've been here, in some cases 20 years, 30 years, leading a productive life, being a productive part of the economy? They perhaps should be given an efficient way to become citizens. We're not talking about that either. I think we're really missing it, but I find a resonance in the American people when you speak of human beings as capable of responding to something which respects their identity and dignity as a human being.
Yeah, I think, I was reflecting yesterday about this. If only the American people now knew what the American system of physical economy was. Like in other words, most of the things we think about as projects now are all things that were discussed in the 1960s. The North
Right.
American Water and Power Alliance, that's one. A
The
space
space program.
program. I mean, that's another one. High-speed rail, that was something that was developed out in Long Island in the 1960s, mid
Right.
1960s.
Right.
So what you see is that I think what's important about that time of the 60s in terms of the assassinations is people became mentally arrested. And so the natural American impulse was arrested, but now that's exactly that what has to be unleashed. And if a president, whoever it is, fails on something, it's our responsibility to correct that by intervention. And that can be done in whatever ways, and it can be done non-violently, and it has to be just be creative. I think that's, and you adapt the methods. You don't do the same thing that was done in the civil rights case. It's a completely different case. But you find ways through the congressional interventions on the Congress or things you might do in the street. But I think that's very much true what you just said.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the point is we want the presidency to succeed. And I also think there's perhaps a bit of an underestimate of how truly evil and entrenched what came to the surface as the collective Biden was. That's sort of like the blackhead at the top of a pimple, to put it in an ugly way. But what was under that, what ran the operations in Ukraine, as we now see from this New York Times article, this was a long-standing, and they don't even go all the way back because they can't afford to, but it was clearly massive. And I think on the brainwashing, what you said about the assassinations, how do you brainwash someone? You have to take the floor they stand on out from under them. You have to create uncertainty and fear. Well, uh, President Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, all assassinated within a 5 year span. I was 2 years old at the time that King was assassinated. I wasn't alive yet when the first Kennedy or Malcolm X assassination occurred. And I don't have so I don't have a memory of that. But it seems to me, had I been a young adult at that time, this would have been extremely unnerving and created a kind of vulnerability for the type of operations that came in.
Well, I can say that if you were conscious, if you were conscientious also, you could have decided that your whole life was going to be changed by that. I did that. I did that before I met Linda LaRouche. It was because in my view, you had to. Uh,
Mhm.
I was 10 years old, well, 11 years old, actually, when JFK was killed.
Hmm.
So that was, and then when the killing of Malcolm happened, most people and most black people did not support Malcolm X. And if they did, they weren't talking about it. Okay. The people that now say that, it's just, no. You were terrified. They weren't going to say anything about Malcolm X, except for the people in New York City, of course, like he was,
Right.
or something like that. No, no. My view of that was, oh, well, chickens come home to roost. That's what he said. And he was being violent, and violence found him. And then I saw his book came out, and the headline on the book said he rose from being dope peddler, hoodlum, thief to becoming the most eloquent voice of the Black Revolution. He said he would be assassinated before this book was printed.
Wow.
Now, since it said that as a forecast, I read the book. And then it was a situation where you sort of didn't know what to think, because if you concluded what you would have to think about that, it was terrifying, too terrifying. So go back to sleep, in my case. Then King is assassinated. And the important thing there was that James Earl Ray said, I was not alone. So even if you thought that James Earl Ray did it, he was saying he wasn't the only person, but the press kept saying he was the lone gunman. So my thinking at that time, I was 15, was wait a minute. If he killed him, he didn't say he didn't kill him, not at that time. Uh, wouldn't you want to take credit for that? I mean, this guy's supposed to be some racist from, Klan type racist. You're going to take credit for that, right? Either you did or you didn't. But he's saying he wasn't alone. Why would you say he is when he's saying he's not? Didn't make any sense. And then RFK's assassination 2 months later. And that was, for me, and I think this is true for a lot of people, that's sort of like, that's it. There's something else that's happening, and we have to find out what it is. And I would say, looking at today, with the near assassination of the present president, Donald Trump, whatever you think about Donald Trump, to think that that is not the same assassination bureau that was aimed at that president. I mean, you got to. I mean, what are we saying? We just had a collective presidency. So I think the show today and the fact that you wanted to focus on this, I think it's very important going forward, literally in the next days and weeks, for people to consider how they should, as citizens, sort of become a kind of citizens committee for the truth. Get active. Get active with TLO. Read. Start intervening. Start asking questions, because the country has to be different. The president's policies on war have to be changed back to what he promised when he got elected. And we can see from the example of King that you can, in fact, make those changes.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. I want to thank you very much for this discussion. I would like to announce two upcoming events. One is April 19th, which is the 250th anniversary of the actual fighting beginning of the American Revolution, the battles of Lexington and Concord, Paul Revere's ride, etc. There will be events in New York and probably also in the Boston area in person. You can send a note to the website. That will also be live streamed, some parts of it. So please, that's a Saturday, April 19th. Then May 24th, 25th is a national in-person conference of the Schiller Institute, which was scheduled that time. It is Memorial Day weekend. In order that we can intervene in this very important moment in American policy shaping and the American political and cultural situation. And again, for that, you can go to schillerinstitute.com. It's there as an event if you want to register and participate. And otherwise, I'd urge everyone to sign up at the LaRoucheOrganization.com, get our emails, donate, help, be active. This is not a time for spectatoritis. This is a big fight that we're in. So thank you very much for joining us, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see you next week.